So as most people here know already, there was a new law passed this year that required that reserve studies be done by all associations. It really did encompass lake associations who previously, in large part, were not doing reserve studies. I know a couple of the bigger lakes here had historically done them, but most of the lakes had not done them in the past. So, you know, everyone is kind of scrambled to get someone. You need to use a licensed engineer or someone who is certified by CAI, the Community Associations Institute, to do your reserve study. But because it was a first try at this for most of the lake associations, we invited David Chesky from the Falcon Group. He's the Executive Vice President of the Civil Engineering Division, and he's going to talk to you about reserve studies and, importantly, reserve funding.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. You have to excuse me, I'm not the best public speaker. I'll do my best, though. As Eileen Bourne just mentioned, New Jersey just recently passed, as of January 8th of this year, 2024, a legislation S2760, which has two parts to it: a structural component and a reserve funding component. And this was really talked about way prior to the unfortunate tragedy in Florida. And really the tragedy in Florida is what's spawned the passing of this most recent law in New Jersey. There's about 26 states in the country now that have some form of reserve funding law, whether it be just to require the preparation of a reserve study or to, in addition to having the reserve study prepared, also fund in accordance with it. New Jersey now being one of the most recent and probably one of the most strict requirements. So there were publications that were written prior to the Surfside collapse, where there was quite a bit of research done on and polls taken on community associations throughout the country about how they felt the importance of funding their infrastructure. And at that time, 80% surveyed felt that it was critical that their associations have adequate reserves. This really is becoming more and more commonplace now. Mortgage companies, when you're buying into an association, especially now that it's law, are requiring to see financials, and even prior to the law, if you were buying into an association, your attorney would most likely want as part of the transaction to see the financials of the association to make sure that they're solvent and they're properly funding. So 40% considered deteriorating infrastructure as a top-ranked concern. If you don't see it failing, it's not really important, especially to folks that aren't involved in the day-to-day management of the infrastructure of the association's common elements. 70% indicated that maintaining the property values was of primary importance of reserve funding, and half of those respondents felt that their community's reserve funds were inadequate. And it's still commonplace. I mean, since this law was passed, there's many associations in the state that we've recently prepared reserve studies for that have never had reserve studies. And they weren't funding, or maybe they were funding some kind of arbitrary number, just based on maybe their common charges. FHA previously had a suggestion to fund 10% of common charges into reserves, but that's not really based on material fact. You want to develop a plan, which is what the reserve study is, that outlines what you're actually responsible for, those common elements, those common assets that the association is responsible for in common, determine the cost of those components, and then come up with a plan to save up money for when those components are due for a replacement. So the money is there in the bank to replace them. So a capital reserve study is the process of identifying, quantifying, and financing the replacement of and maintaining the common elements of the community. It's comprised of two parts. There is a physical analysis, which is when the engineer comes on your property, into the community, assesses the common elements, takes an inventory of the various components, because we need to know the quantity of the various components that you have. So if you're responsible for roads in your community, we need to quantify how many square yards of roadway you have, or if you have docks and bulkheads, we need to measure those areas to determine the cost of that replacement so it's accurate. And then there's a financial analysis where it's an analysis of the association's finances with respect to the reserve fund side compared to how much money you have in the bank on the reserve fund, and how much money you need to save up annually based on the depreciation of those components and various other methodologies. There's 3 levels of a reserve study. There's a full study, a level 1. That's basically when you're starting from scratch. You've never had a reserve study done in the past. You're having the engineer come out to do the physical analysis to measure all the components, to take that quantity inventory, component inventory. There's a level 2 study. A level 2 study is an update with a site visit. Basically the same thing as a level 1, except it doesn't include a component inventory. We're using the component inventory from a previous study that was done, either the last study or maybe a study that was done by another professional. As long as the component inventory is there and the board of the association is comfortable with the component inventory, then it can be reused, and the level 2 study is less expensive to do. So once you have a level 1 study, that's like kind of the top rank. Once that's done, you can then in the future do level 2 studies. And level 3s are updates without site visits, where it's just an adjustment of cost for inflation for the passage of time, adjusting the component life cycles, the remaining life cycles based on the passage of time, and any work that has been performed by the association on the common elements. So the purpose of a reserve study: to offer recommendations as to the amount of money that you should be saving for the eventual replacement of your components, whether it be docks, dams, clubhouses, whatever you're responsible for in common that's defined by your governing documents. That's what that's what the reserve specialist or engineer is going to be looking at to determine how much you should be saving for it. The analysis and recommendations are important to help avoid possible future special assessments or having to finance projects. The whole point of the new law is to have these reserve studies in place so it doesn't put associations in a position where they need to assess the owners for the members for the replacement of these major projects. The analysis should take into account site-specific existing conditions and their useful lives. Can't be a general analysis because then it wouldn't be accurate. It's important to have the engineer go out to the site and see specifically what you're responsible for, and also speak with the board, or if you have maintenance staff, or if you have professionals that take care of your property, to determine what specifically has been happening in the past and what they plan on doing in the future to make the study as accurate as possible. It's not just, it's kind of like the reserve study is kind of like a working plan. It's not just, a one and done type of report. We have to try to get it to be a useful tool for boards to use, going into the future. Why should an association perform? Besides the fact that now it's a law. It meets legal, fiduciary, and professional requirements. Again, as I mentioned earlier, many mortgage companies now are requiring to see that the reserve study is completed. There's a lot of insurance brokers now also are requiring to see the reserve study. The community's governing documents oftentimes have requirements in it for reserve studies. It also provides for the planned replacement of components rather than being reactive to replacing the assets of your community. This is kind of a way to be proactive and plan for these replacements. And as I mentioned earlier, minimizes the need for special assessments, which could be a very large burden for many. It enhances resale values, and the way it does that is if you're proactive in replacing your assets, those assets then are new. If you have potential buyers coming into your community, and let's just say, for example, you have one of your assets that is common is roadways, and a community that has very old roadways and hasn't been saving for the resurfacing of those roadways might be less attractive to a buyer that comes into a community with brand new roadways or some other type of asset. So that will actually have play a factor on the values of the properties. Accounting standards require that proper attention be paid to the replacement fund, and it benefits boards and managers because if you're planning to replace these components, you're saving for the replacements of these components, it reduces the frequency of issues with those assets and potential meetings or angry homeowners and those situations that we don't like to be involved in. So getting into the new legislation, so it basically includes any planned real estate development, any community association in the state that has $25,000 or more in assets. The reserve studies need to be prepared in accordance with there's really two governing bodies that set the standards in reserve studies. There's the Community Associations Institute that Eileen Board had mentioned, national organization that provides educational resources to community associations throughout the country. They're very general in their education, what they provide. They provide education for boards and managers and homeowners. Then there's Association of Professional Reserve Analysts, APRA, and they're specific to reserve study preparation. Both of those organizations have requirements of, they set standards for what is or how reserve studies are to be prepared, and the information that we're required to provide in the reserve studies. They also provide licensing to the professionals that provide these studies. And the study needs to be prepared by a reserve specialist, professional reserve analyst, licensed engineer, licensed architect. Many associations that we've been preparing reserve studies for recently in the past used to do it in-house, and while that in many cases was okay, because it's better than nothing, now they don't want you to do that. They want the professionals to do that for you and to get an impartial third-party report prepared. So the reserve study needs to include, and most of this is stuff that was required to be included originally in just the general standards, but there are some new things. And keep in mind, you guys are all in lake associations. I live in a lake association here in Sparta also. This law was really, because there's two parts to it, there's a structural part and then there's a reserve part. It was really, spawned for, the reserve study part was spawned for all associations. But the structural part obviously deals with, buildings of a structural significance due to the Champlain Towers collapse. So some of the new requirements really pertain to communities that have buildings that have structural implications. They want to make sure that inspections are done. The law wants to make sure that the inspections are done to those facilities so that there's proactive action being taken, so there are no issues with these buildings going forward in the future. But this really applies to all infrastructure, roadways, drainage facilities, dams, which can have structural significance. So the report needs to include the association's capital reserve fund balances, anticipated income and expenses, Analysis of the physical status of the common area components of the buildings and other common areas that the association is obligated to maintain, which was all originally required to be included. Some of the new things that are now required are preventative maintenance. Many associations in the past used to call, or used to have maybe a separate fund called deferred maintenance. The new law doesn't want us to call anything deferred, because that implies that we're deferring the replacement of an asset or component because we're doing maintenance on it. They don't want us to do that. They want us to call it preventative maintenance. And those activities, preventative maintenance activities, are the activities that have a material effect on the life cycle of the components that we're funding for their replacement for. So now they want us, in addition to the saving for the replacement of these components, they also want us to include components for preventative maintenance in the reserve fund. So if you have wood siding on a clubhouse or an outbuilding that you have on your lake, they also not only want us to include funding for the replacement of that wood siding, they also want us to include activities to maintain that wood siding, whether it be painting or staining, wood replacement, things like that. Reasonable estimate of the cost of future reserve study updates. Previously, most associations would fund for or budget for the reserve study itself through operating, because it's kind of like an operating expense. Now they want us to include the actual cost of doing the reserve study every 3 to 5 years in the reserve study itself, so that cost is always there, and you have the money to pull out of reserves to pay for the reserve study to be done. And then the structural inspections for covered buildings. I'm not going to really get into the structural inspections because I don't think anybody here has a covered building. Very specific requirements that stipulate what a covered building is. Yes.
Could you go into the criteria for that? Because it's really more so specific to the use being residential,
yeah.
Right? So
right. So on the structural side, it's a good point. Thank you.
It's okay.
On the structural side, the structural requirements pertain to condominium and cooperative ownership. So residential buildings, not office condominiums or parking garages or anything outside of residential use. And it doesn't apply to rental buildings either. So if you have two buildings that are the same construction, that are considered covered buildings, one is a condominium association and one is a rental building. This law applies to the condominium association only, not the rental building. And that's just how they were able to pass this law, and the rental the rental lobbyists kind of got their word in, and we're able to.
So clubhouses, which I mean, most of the associations, if you have buildings, they're maintenance structures or clubhouses. Those are not subject to the required structural inspection. So don't get uptight about that when you see it. It can be arduous.
Yeah, and what constitutes a covered building is a structure that is anything outside of R5 construction, which is basically if your building is traditional stick frame, wood frame, or a light gauge metal frame, then it's exempt. It's only buildings that have a primary load-bearing structure that is concrete, steel, heavy timber, podium construction. If you have a garage on the first floor, there's columns. Traditional stick frame buildings have redundancy because you're not focusing loads on one particular structural member over a large span. So it's very specific. So if you have a residential building that is stick frame, like a traditional, 2 stories, single family home, it's exempt. And most clubhouses are traditionally stick frame also, so they would be exempt either.
And dams are completely separate. They have their own law.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Now they should be included in reserve funding, which is the other part of the law.
How does that play into the report?
What's that?
So just for example, DEP has mandated an updated hydrologic and hydraulic study, which will be done in a couple of years, and I got a January date for the reserve study, and it'll play significantly into the results of the reserve study.
Yeah, so, I mean, you have to have the reserve study done now, so,
But
you know,
it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you're missing a major component.
well, you're gonna have to update the reserve study either way. So once and again, once you have a relationship with the reserve specialist that's putting your report together, you have the preliminary report complete, and then once you get the hydrologic study complete, if there are any updates that need to be done to the reserve study, you have the reserve specialist update or revise the study to reflect what any recommendations that are given in the hydrological study.
Just a question, when you mentioned drainage as a potential issue that has to be analyzed, what if you have county and township maintain drainage line?
Well, if it's not a common element or a common asset to the association, then it's not something that you would be funding for. Yes?
So you talked about preventative maintenance now being a new addition to reserves. We use our annual operating budget as preventative maintenance. So how do those two work together?
So the way so the law is not very clear on that. There's a lot of things in the law that could have been written better. And so every reserve specialist, engineering firm that is doing reserve studies is interpreting the law the way they see it should be interpreted, based on conversations with. I've had many conversations with the folks that had hands and voices in preparing this law. They're very involved in CAI New Jersey and in the Legislative Action Committee, and so we're basing an interpretation on how it's written and what makes sense. So if an association has a separate preventative maintenance fund or is even funding those preventative maintenance activities through operating, as long as it's being budgeted for and it can be documented, then keep it that way. If there's an association that doesn't have any kind of provisions for taking care of preventative maintenance, then we would include those items in the reserve study.
Is there an outline of what these costs are for doing the initial study, the updates and so forth for small, medium, and large lakes? And we have to go back now and ask for additional funding to do these studies. And you got a blank checkbook because nobody knows.
Yeah, well, the best thing to do is get proposals from engineering firms to do the studies. The fees for the studies range for a level 1 study. I mean, it depends on the size of the community. So, again, based on the size of your community, the engineer will give you a proposal to do the study. But they generally range from $3,000 up to $10,000 for very large communities. Again, it just depends on the size. And the best thing to do is just get some proposals. There's a few firms in the state that do this type of work. You can get proposals from all of them, and
it says one part, which is the engineering side. Then you have what was the second part? There's the engineer, and there's
the physical and financial analysis. It's all one report.
so all have the same.
Yeah. So like we'll do the whole analysis for you. If I'll finish and then I'll take some more questions. Excuse me. Also with respect to covered buildings, now the new legislation requires us to include any corrective maintenance that's suggested by any structural assessments for those covered buildings, which again doesn't really apply to you guys. The reserve study is required now or has always been required to include a proposed 30-year funding plan. So we're looking at a 30-year time window. All projects, all assets that are going to need to be replaced within a 30-year time span is what would be included in the funding plan. It also requires us to include various funding methodologies. And these are, funding methodologies means that these are methodologies that we use to calculate how much money you should be putting away into the fund. We're not just going to do the study and tell you one number. We're giving you options based on different ways to calculate those costs, whether it be depreciation based or cash flow based, which I'll get into in a minute. And any other information necessary to perform an analysis of the adequacy of the association's capital reserve fund balance, or capital reserve fund relative to maintaining the structural integrity of the buildings and common areas. So when do we need to do it? We're now required to do it by law every 5 years. The industry really recommends that you update studies every 3 years because there's changes in costs, inflation, changes in condition. The more frequent you do it, the more accurate the study is. Again, the study is meant to be a working plan for you for saving up for these replacements. It's not just a one and done. Some associations that have recent studies may benefit from having a level 3 study. That's the one that doesn't include a site visit. They're like $1,200 to do. And those studies can be done in the first or second year after a level 1 or level 2 study is done. We had a lot of associations having level 3 studies done after COVID just because of the amount of inflation that occurred during COVID and the cost of material increases that we were seeing. So again, if we're funding based on pre-COVID costs, when you get into, the costs in, say, 2019 are very different than the costs in 2022, or 2023. So you want to just keep up with the changes in costs to make sure that you're putting away the proper amount. So if you've never had a study done, studies are required to be completed by January 8th, 2025. I will say that there's no reserve police. There's no enforcement mechanism written into the law yet, and I say yet. But there are concerns based on my discussions with various attorneys regarding liabilities for boards if they don't follow the law. So we've been told that as long as you're in the process of having a reserve study done, if you've engaged a firm to do it, if you don't have it done by January 8th, nobody's going to come down on you. As long as you're taking the steps to have the study done now. Many of the reserve specialists in the state are very backed up because of the influx of communities requiring reserve studies now. If you had a study done prior to 2019, you have to have a level 1 or level 2 study done by January 8th, 2025. And then I don't think we have any new associations here, so that last one, or the second to last one, applies to new associations. And then after January 2019, so if you had your study done in 2022, then the requirement is 5 years later, 2027. And then 5 years going forward. So reserve funding and expenditures. Can we assess or take out a loan for a project? So the whole point of this law is to avoid assessments. They don't want you to operate on the notion of when a project is due, we're just going to assess for it. And again, this stems from the Surfside collapse. There were financial issues there. They want you to save up and not just assume that you're going to have the money and be able to collect the money when a large project is due. In cases where capital assets reach the end of their life earlier than predicted, there's nothing in the legislation that says that boards can't impose an assessment. In fact, for structural issues with buildings that are covered, they say now that a board can assess without a vote, which was previously you were required to have a vote and pass an assessment. So now the law allows boards to pass an assessment without a vote for structural issues. Again, there's very specific requirements to that and documentation that you would need to have from a licensed engineer or architect saying that there was a structural issue with the building that required that assessment.
Overriding the club's bylaws?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So as I said, you can't base your reserve study on the assumption of scheduled special assessments or even taking out a loan. So reserve funds, one very strict part of the law is that the reserve fund shall be used for the repair or replacement of components that have reached the end of their useful life, as set forth in the most recent reserve study. When an expenditure of the reserve fund is required to repair or replace a component, the association shall use only the amount of the reserve funds allocated by the reserve study to make that repair or replacement. So let's say, for example, let's say a dam, and you need to, let's not talk dams, let's talk roads. Dams. We'll talk roads. Let's say we're responsible for our roads, and it's going to cost $500,000 to resurface our roads, and that's what we have allocated in the reserve study. But when you bid the project out, it's going to cost, the bids come in at $700,000. In accordance with the law, you're only allowed to use $500,000 from the reserve fund for that project. You can borrow from the reserve fund in two stipulations. One that you're going to pay back, you have to have a written resolution by the board that you're going to pay that $200,000 that you're going to borrow back to the reserve fund over the next 5 subsequent years from that borrowing, and as long as it doesn't affect the cost or the funding for the replacement of any other major component that's in the reserve fund. Okay. There's language in the law to make up for deficit funding. There's a lot of misconceptions with how this part of the legislation, what this part of the legislation means. It basically says that if you have a deficit in your reserve funding that equals more than 10% of your previous year's common charges, you have 10 years to make up that deficit. If the deficit is less than 10% of your previous year's common charges, you have 2 years to make up that deficit. But the way many people read that is, we're going to have a reserve study done, and our reserve study is going to say we need to put away $100,000, but we've only been putting away $20,000. So we're $80,000 short. And now, so they think that they have 10 years to make up that $80,000. But that's not the case. Because if you were to do that, you would see negative fund balances. And the whole point of this law is to avoid negative fund balances, to make sure that you have money to pay for the expenses that are scheduled in the reserve study and never go negative. So if you weren't funding what the reserve study recommended, even at the minimum recommendation, you would go negative. So this deficit funding makeup is for prior year deficits, and I'll give you examples of that. So we have Happy Valley Lake Association, and they had their reserve study prepared in 2022. And their reserve study recommended an annual contribution of $250,000 beginning in 2022. Happy Valley decided that they were going to ignore the study and contribute only $50,000 to the reserve fund. This creates a deficit of $200,000 in the reserve fund annually. So they have two options. Option one, in order to comply with the new law, the association can and should conduct a level 2 study, which will recalculate the annual contribution, incorporating updated life cycles, updated costs, historical replacements, etc. The recalculation of the recommended annual contribution will factor in any deficits from the lack of funding from prior years. So if they were funding not what the previous reserve study said, whatever deficits in that funding would be reflected in their initial fund balance, which is factored into part of the calculations that are made as part of the reserve study. And then the association is required to increase its annual funding to one of the provided recommended funding methodologies in the updated study. The association does not need to update the study technically because there's a 5-year requirement. So they don't need to update until 2027 technically. So the association, this is option 2, the association decides not to update the study now in order to comply with the new law. The association is required to increase its annual funding to $250,000 in 2025, because that's what the study in 2022 said, right? So they have to immediately, for 2025, increase to that amount. Now, they have to make up the deficit from not funding $250,000 from 2022 through 2025. So since they only funded $50,000 and of the required $250,000, the deficit is $200,000 per year. The association's has been funding at this level without increases since the last study was prepared. So 3 years of funding $50,000, $200,000 deficit times 3 years is a $600,000 deficit that they need to make up. So they need to compare that $600,000 to their common charges, prior year's common charges, 2024. If that $600,000 is more than their prior year's common charges, then they have 10 years to make up that $600,000 in equal increments. So 600,000 divided by 10, 60,000. They would have to then add 60,000 to that 250 for the next 10 years. So they would actually be contributing $310,000. If, yeah, I just went through that. If that 600,000 is less than 10% of their total common charges for the prior year, then they have 2 years to make up that 600,000, or 300,000 per year for 2 years, on top of the 250, which would be 550,000 in 2025, 550,000 in 2026, and then in 2027 back to 250,000. But in 2027 they need to update the reserve study to have a new contribution recommendation. Board loans and special assessment powers, just some more on that. Notwithstanding the terms of the governing documents of the association, the board may, without the consent of the owners or approval of a developer selling units in real estate development, adopt an assessment payable by the owners over 1 or more fiscal years, or obtain a loan as the board determines are reasonable whenever necessary to fund the cost of corrective maintenance of primary load-bearing systems of a planned real estate development. This is getting back to what we were just talking about the loans. And this, again, it needs to be documented by a licensed engineer or an architect that it constitutes an imminent or reasonably foreseeable hazard to health or safety, and will result in a material increase in the cost of corrective maintenance if it's delayed. And that's all I have, and I'd be happy to answer questions. I think we had a question back in the back.
Can you just cite the actual the actual bill we want?
It's S2760. Yes, in the back here.
You have items on the reserve studies. I like the reserve study a few years ago. And it says the expected life expectancy ends in 2025. And 2025 comes along and the item is not in disrepair, it's in good condition. How does that, we just wait until we do the update 3 to 5 years and then re-update the life expectancy of that particular item?
Yes, so very good question, thank you. The reserve study is a guide. Nothing in it, particularly with respect to the life cycles and the costs, because they're estimates, is written in stone. So if there's something that is scheduled for 2025 and it's in good shape and it doesn't necessarily need to be replaced in 2025 and you plan to do it in 2026, and by all means, do it in 2026, or if it's in even better shape, you can extend the life, great, and that will be updated when you do your next update to the reserve.
And if there was an item on the study that the community said, you know what, we don't need to replace this, it's not a need anymore, that would just fall off the reserve study when we had to update it? Like a playground, if we have 5 playgrounds and the community says, well, we don't really need to spend $50,000 to replace this one particular playground, let's just remove it. Is that something that is an option to just not do, or?
Well, you have to have the conversation with your reserve specialist or engineer on that, as well as legal, because you can't necessarily take away an amenity without amending your documents. If you originally have 5 playgrounds
Right.
in the community, you can't just
Well,
decide
it
to
would
take
be the
one away.
community voting to not replace it. You know?
If you amend your documents and
Okay.
it passes, then yeah, absolutely, you can take it off the reserve study.
And the last question is, we have multiple funds in our community. We have the reserve fund,
Mhm.
we have other funds with money in it that we use to replace these items that are in the community. So
Okay.
the funding would include all our funds that are in saved accounts. It doesn't have to be titled capital reserve fund. Is that correct?
Yes, what we don't want to do is fund for things in more than one place, right? Just like you're operating, you want to have one line item for something and be saving for that in one place. So as long as you're funding for that item or that asset somewhere, that's really all that matters. And that, again, is a discussion that you have with whomever is preparing the reserve study. Make sure that either we're including that into the reserve fund and taking those monies that you're saving and incorporating into the balances of the reserve
Savings for
fund.
those items.
Right, right. Yes?
Can you make this PowerPoint available on the COLA website?
I'll do that. Yes, it's going to be. Yes.
I just need some clarification about who needs to do the reserve study and what you consider an asset. Because you said planned real estate development with $25,000 or more in assets. So does assets, is it man-made things, but then you're saying it's not residential? So like docks, boats, like is that all part
Yeah,
of your assets?
so there's 2 parts to it. The non-residential part applies to the structural requirements of the new legislation, which doesn't apply to most of us in here. I don't think probably any of us in here. But the reserve study part of the legislation applies to any community association. They call it planned real estate development, but really it's community associations that have $25,000 or more in assets. So that includes anything that you're responsible for in common.
So it would include docks?
It would include docks, it would include your beach, it would include your sheds and your beach houses and any treatment facilities that you have for your lakes and your dams, obviously, and any roads that you have, any facilities that you're required to maintain as a community, that's what
And is there any
is included.
distinction between whether you're a mandatory membership association versus you choose?
Eileen?
So the second part of the Structural Integrity Act is a change to the Planned Real Estate Development Full Disclosure Act. So if you're not an association under that act, then this reserve change to that act doesn't apply to you. So generally, that's mandatory versus voluntary association. So if you're not a mandatory membership association, then that PREPA Act doesn't apply to you, then the Reserve Study Act doesn't apply to you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm unclear how dams fit into this. I probably have the smallest association here, so maybe I'm a little sensitive to the issue. Our annual budget is $8,000. We have a beach, we have a shed, and we have a swimming pool. Of course, we have a lake, and we have a dam. Are you saying, or does the law say, that I have to cash reserve to replace my dam over 30 years?
Not necessarily replacing. I mean, it depends on the makeup of your dam and what you have there. I mean, if it's an earth, it depends. Is the answer. What kind of dam do you have? Is it an earthen dam? Is it a concrete structure? Are there hydraulics?
It's an earthen dam. We have an engineer inspection every 4 years. It's all fine. So, logically, isn't there a point where a dam has a useful life? And don't I have to fund that? And then I have to fund it cash? Not regarding funding that might be available, which would maybe be 100% of the cost? I'm having a hard time with
Yeah. Again, it depends on what the actual facility is comprised of and the cost of that facility over the next 30 years. I mean, you might not need to replace the dam in the next 30 years, but you might need to do repairs or improvements to it. And that's what is to be included in this. Again, just setting a plan for your association of what needs to be done and when, so that the funds are there. And for an association that's that small with very limited assets, the cost to do a reserve study is not a whole lot.
Well, I would say my entire infrastructure cost us $10,000 to build. So if there's a $25,000 asset limit, then my only other asset is the lake. And what's that worth? Is that worth the assessed value?
Well, the
that
lake is not something that has
gives me?
the lake doesn't have a it's not something that's going to need to be replaced in 30 years. We're looking at like hard assets, hard common elements that are going to need major refurbishment or replacement over 30
And
years.
dam is considered a hard asset.
Depends on how the dam is constructed. Whether it's going to need full replacement or repairs. Might need repairs, and you might need to fund for those repairs depending on the cost of those repairs. So you get a reserve specialist involved or an engineer involved, they'll tell you, give you an idea of what you can expect in the future. If you have dam inspections done by an engineer, have a conversation with them to determine what repairs you should expect over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And then you'll have an idea of the costs involved.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
A lot of the lakes in Florida, specifically, a beach and a dam is the only asset.
Yeah, I have one.
So how can we combine that, the reserve study, so that, you know, we could, I mean, $3,500 for a reserve study, you know, and we might have different composition of financial makeup, but I mean, the assets are, what are we doing? It's all about the dam.
It is all about
And I got the DEP to mandate that stuff. Now, I understand, you know, so other than the financial aspect of each individual organization, I mean, what are we coming on site?
But you have-
All these little lakes in Sparta for?
Yeah, you have.
Can't we combine them?
I don't know that you can combine them because the studies
I mean, there
are-
should be some financial benefit of coming together as COLA.
In what regard? To do the actual study?
Well, I mean, I just got a quote from Falcon for $3,500, and, you know, it's like, it's the same issue for every lake here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, unfortunately, it takes time to put these reports together. It's not
No,
the same.
I get
for-
that, but I mean, most of the stuff should be cookie cutter other than the financial analysis.
It's not though. It's not.
I mean,
it's not
but
good.
it's all the
Still,
same.
it still takes time to do the inspections. It takes time to put the reports together. It is time intensive, and that's what the fees are.
But we should be able to come together as an association and you know.
And
get
there are
a bigger
things
bang
that
for our buck.
there are things that can be done, you know, to get discounts going
I'll
for
put
multiple. What's that?
I'll put you up a lot.
Yes, sir.
So, is COLA taking any kind of action with legislators at all with regards to this? I mean, we've already gotten to the point where we've had a reserve study done of things, and we've never had it done before. And I'm learning that there's a great number of lake communities that are in the same situation where they've never had this done before. Just rough numbers, initially we got back, we were looking at a dues increase of nearly 70%.
Wow.
To our members because of this. So, of course, our members are revolting, put it like that. Thrilled about this. I even went so far as to go down and have a meeting with the CAI in Freehold, and I was surprised their attitude was, they seem to be of the mindset is this whole thing is for condos associations, and lake communities they don't know nothing about. And their attitude for me, their comments to me were, you've never done this before? Everybody does this. We're just codifying in the law what you guys should have been doing of this. So they weren't really of any help to me, that I feel. A lot of the members who are objecting to the dues increase of things are asking, what are you guys doing and COLA doing to fight the New Jersey legislators who put this law into effect? Because their attitude is, our folks' attitude is, we're kind of you know, this law is intended for condo buildings like in Surfside and Florida thing, why are we being lumped into this law?
It's not really intended for just condo buildings. I mean, there's many
Well, I
associations
know that
that have.
it includes all planned real estate development things, but I think that the mindset was it was made to go after like condo buildings and stuff like that.
On the structural end of things, but reserve studies are financial budgeting tools for boards. I mean, you take a community like Lake Mohawk, it's not a small community. They have assets that are,
I get
are
that,
huge.
but if we're going to, once this rolls out, I'm sure it's not just our community, I'm sure it's a lot of folks in this room, all the members are gonna see a significant dues increase thing. So is that being brought to the attention of legislation players who want this bill into effect? Is it aware of that? I don't know if Eileen has any.
I know there have been other you know, voices going to the legislation and trying to, you know, argue this. I don't know the details of it because I'm not necessarily involved in that part of it. I don't know if Eileen has any experience on that.
Yeah, you know, not to be polite, but you know, this has been an issue before in terms of the planned real estate development law. So the reserve part is a change to the planned real estate development law. Historically, lake associations did not fall under that planned real estate development law because it was meant to cover any association that was formed after 1979. So the lake associations were all exempt, they're predominantly exempt from that. What happened in 2017, which we've talked about at these meetings a couple of times, is there were amendments to the law that said, and by the way, these amendments apply to all associations that were formed by a common developer where you have individually owned properties and common properties as well. That changed, basically, the definition of who this law applies to. So now, when these laws get changed, the lake associations are pretty much stuck with it, even though they don't really have a seat at the table. So CAI is a large organization. It literally is 99% condominium associations, a couple of historic homeowner associations like, you know, the Radburn community, you know, associations that have been around for a long time. But they have never really specifically looked at lake associations, so lake associations are basically being swept into these regulations. This particular regulation is good practice. A lot of the lake associations have had kind of informal, their own internal, you know, reserve studies done, where they look every year and say, well, we're going to need to replace the roof of the clubhouse at some point, and you put aside the money to do that. That is good practice. It does make good sense to do that. One of the things, though, that the NJ Cola Board talked about at our most recent meeting, and we actually, our most recent board meeting, where we had a member from the New York Cola come in and talk to our board, is how can we have a seat at the table? How can we get representation in the state of New Jersey? Well, the two ways to do it is work through our local legislators in Morris, Sussex, Passaic, where most of our lakes are located. They have historically not been helpful. You know, they should be in there fighting for the lake associations. We have tried, you know, in terms of getting the dam funding done, in terms of making changes to the law. They have not been helpful. Sometimes they've been the opposite of helpful. But the other thing that we've talked about doing, like New York Cola has lobbying power. They have the ability to hire lobbyists to represent the lake. Now, it's a much bigger organization. There's many more lakes in the state of New York than we do, and much larger lakes in New York. But it comes at a cost. So then we have to go back and look and say, are our members willing to pay $300 per association, $500 per association in order to hire a lobbyist? So that's one of the things the board is talking about. We have a planning meeting every year in January. You know, so, and we're going to talk about getting everybody's input. Is that worthwhile for us as an organization to increase the amount of dues that the lake associations pay, to expand the membership to business partners and other places where they're looking at New York's model and how to do that? Then we can get a lobbyist who might be able to assist in saying, okay, this shouldn't really apply. I'm not sure it would have worked in this case. I think that the general premise is reserve studies are a good idea, even though the lake associations don't have the residential buildings that, you know, that are really the problem from the surf side. But it is, they have dams, you know, it could be equally dangerous.
Yeah, I get that. I appreciate it, but when I'm delivering this message to our membership about their dues are gonna be substantially, after they're done chasing me with a pitchfork, the questions are coming at me as like, well, we're not doing this. We're not gonna vote till we please our dues things. Go tell the state of New Jersey and council.
Yes.
Or what can we do to dissolve our association? Because why are we paying all this money to, what are you doing for us? That's the question I'm being faced with.
No, I totally understand this, particularly because the law was passed in January, and most league associations are not members of CAI. It really is a condo-driven organization, but that also, you know, drives the legislation. And so most of the league associations basically didn't even have the money set aside for the budget year 2024 in order to do the reserve study. So I 100% agree that it would be nice if the league associations had more, you know, of a lobbying presence or a presence at all. But because of the size of the organization and really the lack of funding, you know, we do what we can informally. You know, board members are doing it all the time, reaching it out. You know, some of the league associations this here today got a dam loan award 2.5 years ago, and it hasn't been appropriated yet. From a fund that's sitting at DEP. That's how ineffective our local representatives have been in representing the interests of the lake associations. But that's, I think, where we need to start, is with our own local representatives. And we have a plan to invite a bunch of them to an upcoming meeting to say, here's what our problems are. But I have to admit, we've done that in the past, and they have not been motivated. You know, we even pointed out to them how many people in Sussex County, for example, live in the lake association, and yet, you know, it's just not in line with that.
Just one quick thing, if I can talk about that. At White Meadow Lake on October 21st at 8 p.m., we're having a candidates night for the people running for public office. We usually get a pretty good turnout of representatives that are running for public office. So any of you are welcome to come or send a representative from your lake and ask these questions to the representatives that are there looking for your vote. They come, and it's not just Morris County people that are running, people running for the state, people running for local government come to our candidates night. So that's a place where, you know, they'll be congregating where all the lake communities can come and give your concerns to them and maybe get an ear on them and then, you know, get contact information so we can constantly pound them to do stuff for the lake communities. It's at White Meadow Lake in Rockaway, 100 White Meadow Road. It's October 21st at 8 p.m. Yeah, I'll do that.
So our state senator, your state senator, should be there. So you should contact your state senator and ask them to be there so that he avoids.
Questions? I'm sorry. Question here first, then we'll go to you.
Is there a list of engineers that specialize in lakes? I mean, you're talking about these engineers that are going to do assessments for condos and co-ops and so forth. Is there a list specifically for those that do lake? Yeah. So that, you know, we can kind of get through those.
I can answer this only informally, is that I took the list that CAI publishes of anyone who is a reserve specialist like Falcon on it, and then I sent around an email to NJ Cola saying, who have you used? And I got a bunch of responses and put it in one document. So I can send that document to you. It's a starting point, you know, for people who want to call a bunch of different places and get a proposal.
Can you put that on the Cola website?
Sure, yep.
Okay, we had a question in the back there.
Just go, I mean, you represent, Cole represents 85 lake associations, and lake association, you know, 100,000 people that belong to both. And I go around the state with other organizations, either one of them know about coalition lake associations, a lot of them don't. So, I mean, yeah, I think that we could be a very big voice, talk about legislation, talk about lobbying. We could be our own voice, to be a good opportunity to meet with these representatives and say, listen, hey, we represent, there's 65 lakes just in Sussex County alone, right? So that's 65 lake associations, and obviously they're all the largest over in Island Lakes are probably the next. But I mean, those are thousands and thousands of people, those are thousands and thousands of people.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm heavily involved in CAI. My firm is heavily involved in CAI. I'm actually past president of CAI, not New Jersey, but in Hudson Valley, New York. And the Coalition of Lake Associations is never talked about. It's not even, I don't think, probably 90% of the folks involved in CAI even know that the Coalition of Lakes exists. If you guys get involved in CAI, that's the only way to make yourselves known. So get involved in LAC. They have a legislative action committee in CAI. So if we have a representative from the coalition involved in LAC, I think, you know, and getting your creating a presence with CAI, I think is probably, you know, a good first step in my opinion. Yes.
It seems a lot of the COLA meetings we've been having recently are in response to the increase in bureaucracy from the state of New Jersey. And whether we do have a lobbyist or pay everybody chips in for a lobbyist, I think, or have all of us go to a meeting that those politicians are there. I think if we have a grassroots program where we send to all our members that are not happy with us the information of contacting their people, and then all of us have 10% of our members do that, I think that's much more effective than whatever else we can come up with to kind of sway New Jersey the way we want them to go.
Any other questions? Yes.
How is this being monitored? Like this gentleman over here is saying, if our association doesn't want to do it, we're not going to do it. What, is there a penalty? Who's monitoring it? Is it part
No,
of your...
there isn't. Not yet. There's no...
I was told, correct me if I'm wrong too, but I was told, yeah, there is no penalty enforcement yet.
Right.
But wait until the state doesn't get their pound of flesh, then they'll figure that out. But until that time, I'm being told there's repercussions are that, I always get this screwed up, is it Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, whatever things, are not going to finance mortgages in your community.
There's a couple of concerns. That's one of them.
Right, and also too is fiduciary liability to the board members for not putting this in place.
Because now it's law, and I'm not an attorney, but I've been told by many attorneys that I do lots of meetings with, that now that it's law, if a board doesn't follow it, and it affects the sale of a home in the community, because let's say the buyer requests this documentation and finds that the association is not funding in accordance with the reserve study or didn't have a reserve study done, and that causes the sale to fall through, the seller of that home can bring action against the board, and the board can be held liable because it's law.
So what's stopping board members from walking away now? Because it's one thing to be volunteering your time to do this and so forth. Now you're invoking fiduciary and legal action if it's something outside of your control. Somebody could, today or on January 9th, lose the sale on the house, and then now you can say, oh yeah, I can sue you. It's going to make lawyers happy because you just opened the ball.
Well, I think my thought on that was like, look, I'll do all the compliance stuff, I'll put this out there and put it to the vote to the general membership for a thing, and if they vote it down, then, I don't know. I think that's my defense.
As a board member, you're still accountable.
Maybe, you can always be named and an attorney can sue you for anything, but, our defense is like, look, hey, I did my thing, the membership elected to not put this in place.
As I read the law, we don't need to also go for membership to get this, we can just do it to be compliant.
Yeah, it's a board action.
Everybody just say, hey, this is the deal, you're paying this, and that's all we're doing.
right. That's right.
Take one more question.
And I think
One more question.
the question was for Eileen, this is going back to the voluntary versus mandatory membership. So, so is this again, like, if you're saying a potential homeowner requests your financials, can they do that if you're a voluntary membership?
You can say, right, if that, they can ask for it, but you don't have to give it. You don't have to, well, you can explain to them that you're not an association under the planned real estate development law, so this aspect, the reserve study part of that law doesn't apply to your association.
So therefore, I don't have liability as a citizen.
Right. And your liability as a board member is generally covered both under the indemnification provisions of the New Jersey Nonprofit Act, as well as directors and officers liability insurance. But yes, there definitely is an aspect of it that says it's your fiduciary obligation to follow the law. So if you're not following the law, you're acting, outside of your fiduciary obligation, and that can be problematic.
Thank you very much, everyone.